Hey friends, working remotely is no longer a luxury, it's a necessity. And as businesses have rapidly transitioned to hybrid or purely remote work, the need for secure, compliant, and hassle-free remote access is paramount. So, what's the simplest, fastest, and secure way to connect to remote Windows computers and apps? That is TrueGrid. It's designed to simplify and modernize Microsoft Remote Desktop services without the fuss. No more exposed firewall ports or VPN. It's a zero-trust remote desktop solution with an integrated multi-factor auth. You've got cybersecurity and an insurance-compliant environment. It streamlines your entire remote desktop access, makes you invisible to potential online threats. Everyone authenticates in the cloud before even getting a sniff of your network. And the real game changer, TrueGrid's secure RDP can deliver remote app to any device with just a button press and no latency. If you value your time, your security, and your sanity, TrueGrid is a no-brainer. So if you're ready to transform your remote access setup, get a demo of TrueGrid today at demotg.com. That's demotg.com, and you'll get an exclusive 20% discount on your first purchase. That's TrueGrid. Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm talking with Dr. Janne Jul Jensen. She is the CEO and co-founder of Henosia and a UX designer and software engineer. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. And hopefully you're well as well?
I am. And you mentioned that your middle name, Jul, means Christmas. So you're Dr. Christmas.
I am Dr. Christmas. Not Santa Christmas, but...
Yeah, but this is great because we are recording this around the holidays. So this is a gift for all of us. This is exciting. So you are a software engineer, but you identified a problem. And with all good software engineers, you couldn't stop thinking about it. So you decided to spin up an entire company to solve the problem, which is such a classic engineering thing to do. You just can't stop thinking. So you make a company around it to make a product.
And that's true. And it just so happens that my co-founder in Henosia has had the same train of thought separate from me. And then when we met at the past company where we worked, we got to talking about this. Me coming from the design side, him coming from the developer side, we realized that we were having the same itches that weren't being scratched with design tools. And if I go into that briefly, the problem is that as a designer, with a software engineering background, I've always felt that vector design tools as they are inadequate because what you design in there primarily is the way things will look, not how they will work. And the famous Steve Jobs quote says, design is not just how it looks and how it feels, it's how it works. And the whole how it works part, we weren't really getting that nailed in the design tools that we have available to us. So the more dynamic an application is, the more stateful it is, the more we quickly ran into problems of not being able to design anything else than just plain poster design.
Yeah. I'm trying to think about how I did websites in the late 90s and in the early 2000s. And for a very, very long period of time, a designer would make a mock-up. They'd call it a mock-up, and they would deliver it as a Photoshop file. So it was done entirely in graphics, usually at the same resolution that the typical user was at. So it was not vectors, it was bitmaps at maybe 1024 or HD. And then not a designer, but someone who had a knack with websites would have to basically go side by side and try to recreate the entire thing. Then we'd have arguments with the business person about pixels. And we'd say, well, that can't move 5 pixels to the left because CSS won't allow it. And then they would fight for a number of months. And this is kind of a handoff of sorts as we hand off something from the designer who then declares that their work is finished. And then they hand it off to someone who tries to get it closer to production. And that's kind of a gap, that handoff.
Yeah, it is. And it's a universal problem within software development and has been for over 30 years. And it's not like we haven't moved in those 30 years because, like you said, we started in Photoshop. And then the next tool after that was vector graphics. And people were like, oh, wow, now we can go all the way with this. And then as they caught on, first Sketch, then Figma, people found out that, we can do so much more. Now it's less of a poster design, but there's still so much left. Just to give you an example, if you go technical with me for a minute, then Figma has 20 something data types. And compared, Typescript has 362, I think it is. So that's basically a factor 18 in power, expressive power. So it's not even the designer's fault. You just don't have the power to express, the full possibilities that are available to you in, for instance, Typescript. So that's why the handoff gap persists, because everything that you can't do in those 20-something data types has to then be done through Jira tickets and presentations to the developer and question asking and back and forth. And all of what we know is the handoff gap.
So let me push on that technical analogy that you made there for a second. Mm-hmm. So TypeScript in this context would be a strongly typed programming language with a great deal number of intrinsic types, as you point out, and of course an unlimited number of types that one could create, including complex types and derived types. But then the types, and I'm trying to put myself in the mind of the Figma creator, are those types trying to mirror or have a one-to-one?
Roughly, right? Yes. And those 20-something types they have are obviously largely focused around the visuals. And then, for instance, I don't know if you use Spotify. I'm presuming you do because everybody does. And if you go into Spotify on your phone and you start playing one of the more popular songs by one of the big bands, then that's a classical example of something that's highly dynamic and highly stateful, because at any given time, that song will be at a certain point. There will be audio involved that Vector Tool doesn't solve very well. The statefulness, it doesn't solve very well. There'll also be a video playing in the background that you can't also do in Figma. So that's just one example of an application where, yes, I can make, if you took a screenshot of Spotify while it was playing, then I could do that for you in Figma. But having the actual song bar move and count seconds and the video moving and the audio playing, I wouldn't know how to do that in Figma. And even if I could, because you probably could, but that would be through a major lot of jumping through hoops to make those few data types do all of that.
Interesting. And then I would assume, even if you could, like if Figma built up all of that, infrastructure, you'd be coding it at some point coding it in Figma. And I'm saying that with air quotes. And then you would have to, once again, hand it off and translate it into TypeScript or C# or whatever. Exactly. So you never have the full high fidelity of the end.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because at some point people have seen this for a while, and people have wanted to allow designers to code for a while without having to actually write code, because most designers don't want to do that. If they did, they would have become developers. There's a reason they became designers. So then they came out with no-code and low-code tools, because you could, or plug into Figma that allows you to export to code from there. But it's a way of creating code to rule out what you were just saying, that essentially the product is being produced twice, first in a design tool and then afterwards in code. So it's double work. And what do we do with double work? Wherever we find it, we try to eliminate it. So no code and low code tools came about, but it still doesn't solve the problem for a number of reasons. The code that comes out of them is of varying quality. And it's usually not something that a good developer would push to production. It would need some cleanup before then.
We actually tolerate that code. Like I've had tools where we'll export it and I'll be like, oh,
exactly,
that's fine. It's a lot of divs. I wouldn't do it that way, but it's fine. And then we tolerate it. And that causes technical debt.
Yeah, exactly. So why should I have a win on the expense of you? Why shouldn't it be a win-win between designers and developers? So that's one problem. Another problem is the fact that you get vendor locked in. And the no-code, low-code tools will tell you don't, because they'll say, but at any time you can just export to code and take it anywhere. Yeah, that's all well and good, but I can't take it to another no-code or low-code tool because none of them can import. And the reason they can't do this, and this is where the new stuff comes in, is that just like Figma works in its own data format and Sketch works in its own data format, so does all of the no-code and low-code tools out there. So essentially you have this black box that at some point it vomits out a blob of code, basically. And you take that and do with it what you want. But as soon as it does that, it's sort of in the word export. you go from one data format to another data format. As soon as you change data format, you lose data. That can't be avoided. And that's the reason that they can't read it back in. So then Jim, my co-founder from Henosia, we got to chatting and we got to talking. And we figured out that, well, if that's the case, we can't change data format because then we lose data and then we can't do the round tripping to GitHub, for instance. Then we need to figure out how we can work directly in the medium that our production code is in. Not a black box, but working directly on top of the tech stack that you're producing your product in.
I'm pausing because that's like my software engineer brain is like, but that sounds really hard. Like that sounds like a hard problem because you're effectively saying that the data format is now going to be code, whether they be templates. And then, of course, you're going to have to handle multiple programming languages because they all have different template formats. I assume you'll pick one by default. But what you're trying to do is avoid the export completely. If there is no import and there is no export, there is only shared truth.
There's read and write. One source of truth. Yep, that is exactly what we're doing. And I'm glad that you're pausing and going, that's difficult. Because I get up in the morning and look in the mirror and saying, what the heck were you thinking? Trying on something like this for size. We've been doing that for 3 years. We're moving the needle, but yes, it is super hard. It is a hypercube of dimensions that need to fit together. Because, well, essentially what it takes is something along the lines of a code engine running within a code engine, so the browser's code engine, then multiplayer on top, because everybody expects that. It has to be in the cloud as well. And then you have to be able, down the line, we don't start there, to be able to handle all these different kinds of technologies in a tech stack. Right now, what we've chosen, for obvious reasons, it's the most widespread in each of its levels. So it's TypeScript, it's React, it's Next.js, then it's GitHub, and then we've just recently started supporting Shatsian for the components, because that gives you all of the accessibility and all of the logic and all of the, all of that you get built in. So that's where we're starting. And I know that some people are going to ask us, well, what about Angular? What about Solid? What about Remix? What about, and so on and so forth. If we succeed with this, if we get all the way through this tech stack, then we'll start expanding to other tech stacks afterwards. But yeah, it is a huge undertaking. No doubt about it.
I like that you called out, multi-user and you said multiplayer. Like everyone expects it because like Google Docs, I go back to the moment, 15, 20 years ago when we all saw Google Docs for the first time and we saw simultaneous editing. Instantly, that became table stakes. It was like, okay, now the minimum bar is that. And the way that when you open up the Henosia design tool that helps you edit code while you design, you can see a mouse cursor with the person's name, which is it looks like a nod to Figma, but what it really is, it's a nod to that is the metaphor that we have all selected as a society. Like as a culture, you get a mouse, it's colored with a specific color. Yours is purple, mine is green, and it has your name on it. So it's already familiar. So someone who is familiar with Figma will go, I know this. We can work together in this. But then you point out the multidimensionality of it. Suddenly the problem gets way harder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. There's a reason this problem hasn't been solved for 30 years. It's because it's a hard problem. And because there's no shortcuts. Because it has to be this way because we can't escape the nature law that there will be data loss if you change data format. So we don't have an option other than being in the same format if we want to get to that like Zen place of having one source of truth. Because the handoff gap happens everywhere because we have two sources of truth. You have the design and you have the code, and which one is the right one? I mean, I bet you know the pain of having to pick up a product again 6 months later to expand a feature or something like that. And then you spend the first 2 months making those two back in sync because they've drifted. You've done these bits and bobs on the code that weren't reflected in the design and all of that back and forth to figure out, okay, so are they actually in sync now? And then you can start designing that expansion that you were looking for. So if we want one source of truth, and if we want to, because that's the flip side of one source of truth, is that you actually empower the designers to have control of what they have responsibility for. Because that's what happened.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. Because with tools like Figma and with working with designers, often they won't participate in GitHub, which means that they're not participating in the software development lifecycle. And there's this gap, there's this constant gap where they're off running on sometimes one schedule, sometimes a different schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Things are emailed around, links are sent around, and we feel like it's integrated because you'll have a link to a Figma within a Jira ticket or a link to a Figma within an Azure DevOps ticket, but they don't feel like team members, but you're really integrating them into the entire team.
I mean, I normally call myself a tech influencer, if you will, because that's what I do. I only influence the product. I don't actually create it. The developer does. And all that gets into the product is whatever I can influence him or her to put into the code. And if they, for one reason or another, decide that that wasn't important, or that can't be done, or we don't have time for that, or there's an easier way or a smarter way, then there isn't much I can do about it, because I don't have my hands in the nitty gritty. I only have my hands on their shoulder and can say pretty please. And it's not a nice situation to be in when you really care about the work that you do and you want to be able to be proud to put your name on the design that goes out the door. And then when that's actually somebody else's control and responsibility, or somebody else has control of that, but it's your responsibility, and you have to put your name on something that others have done. And if that in some cases is subpar, it's not a nice experience.
Yeah. Just as a random aside, when you said that, when you were drawing that picture and I was visualizing you as the product owner with your hand on the shoulder of the designer saying, pretty please, I heard the double meaning there because you're both saying, please do it, but also make it pretty.
Yeah, make it pop.
Pretty please.
Exactly. That's what we're setting out to do as well. One thing is solving the handoff gap, and the other thing is actually empowering the designer to finally be able to have direct control of what they've always had as a responsibility.
Okay, and that's about ownership, and that's an interesting one because, again, we're talking about designers, and we don't have anyone but ourselves in this podcast. But I don't mean to talk about them behind their backs, but there's a feeling that they give you the design, and then they throw their hands in the air, and they go, "Well, I couldn't control what came out on the screen because I gave them the poster." And I love that you called it a poster because they really create a big static movie poster in Figma with a bunch of stuff, and then they just are disappointed when the thing comes out and it doesn't look the way they want. You're infusing ownership into the designer. It's their design because they hit save and they committed it directly into Git.
And I get that it's an easy way out to just throw your hands in the air and point at the developer. But that doesn't exactly do good things for the collaboration, does it?
That's a great point because collective code ownership is not just for the business and to ship the successful product. It's to make people feel like they own the thing and they can be involved, which is great too, because you show in the tool in Henosia, not just like regular diffs, like text diffs, but visual diffs before and after. So when you make a change collaboratively, the designer can make the change and then the developer can see the before and after as a side-by-side visually. And then, you could do code reviews. They could participate in code reviews just like everyone else.
Exactly. It's something that no matter the size of the organization, I've heard them talk about for years and years. Oh, we need to break down the silos. That you hear that's corporate speaking. You hear that everywhere all the time. Yeah. Yet we are siloed with our tools. We are siloed with the medium that we work in. There's so much built in that reinforces the silos. And I really wish we could get to a place where I'm not a designer and you're not a developer, but we are product creators, both of us.
That would be great.
That's what we are. That's what the PM is as well, and the translator and the copywriter and graphical designer and whoever else is involved. We are all product creators because if any one of our roles is missing, you can see that in the product.
So then it seems like what we're doing today is the designer makes a drawing that shows their intent. I intend it to look like this, but what you're proposing is to put a little bit more onus on the designer to ship a user experience that is going to ultimately be expressed in shipping code.
Yeah. And it also gives that immediate feedback loop that we don't have. Because if I am sitting and designing directly in code visually, I get immediate feedback and I can see how it works. And if that's the experience I was going for. Today, if I want to see how it works, I make a poster design, maybe a prototype. Then I raise a Jira ticket. Then I wait for a developer to have time in some sprint at some point. Then they do their thing. They ping me back. They spin up a test server. I look at it. It's not what I wanted. And then we do 3 times that dance once more. So compared to immediate feedback of me just trying out things and seeing how that works and if it works, it's just so much more efficient compared to what we have today.
Right. We call that the developer's inner loop. You make a change, and then it's like, I made the change, I hit save. Yeah. How long is it going to take? Is it going to take 15 minutes until a container spins up and I can see it in a test server? Mm-hmm. Or can I do it locally? So that brings it to my next question, because interactivity is a big part of this. I mean, your PhD is in human-computer interaction. It's about interacting, not just having it look good, but having it move well and feel good.
Yep.
How am I able to see it in action when I push a button or when I do something in the tool? Am I spinning up a local server, or how do we go from static to dynamic?
For those who know some of the vector tools out there, you have your canvas and you do your design there, and then you have a play button where you actually go from being in design mode to being in let me test it out mode. We have the exact same thing in Henosia. So you have your canvas and you do all of your design. And if I click on a button there, I select the button and can change the color or whatever I want to do with it. But if I go into play mode and I select the button or I press the button, it doesn't select it. It presses it. So I can see, what does it look like in press states? What does it look like in hover state? What does it look like in focus state? And all of these sorts of things. So I can get the feel for the experience. And then when I'm happy with what I have, I go out of play mode again and I can continue with the design.
Interesting. Okay.
So that's the thing. I mean, I have the code running directly on my canvas.
Okay. It's running inside your canvas.
Yep.
And then one of the things that would hold us back, many years ago, was when the CSS started getting very clever, meaning that we started introducing variables, and then design systems became a thing. So what if I'm using a design system like Braid, which is a pretty sophisticated design system?
Braid is actually a really good design system.
Yeah, you're a fan?
Yeah, I am. We actually started out supporting that as the very first one in Henosia.
Okay.
Because
so the design systems are supported.
If you say design systems, and I'll say, just like I did with everything else in the tech stack, that some of them are supported. But again, there needs to be code modifications for every single design system out there. So right now we have Shatsian on board. We have played around with Braid. We've played around with Material UI. Obviously, there's Fluent Design as well, and there's other ones out there. And we'll start supporting them as the need arises, basically. But right now, we have got bigger fish to fry, which essentially means that there's so many like hardcore problems that needs to be solved before we can start, widening that very, very thin technical slice through all of the layers in the tech stack.
When you're doing a startup like this, would it be appropriate to call this a startup?
Oh, yes, very much so.
Okay. How do you deal with the kind of the overwhelmingness of the problem, and then the limitedness of the number of humans that you have involved, and presumably the money and all that kind of stuff? Like, every big problem starts with like 2 people and a napkin in a cafe. Mm-hmm. It seems overwhelming to have such a big problem to solve. And
yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, how do we deal with it?
I just feel like I would just give up, because I just be like, oh, this is too hard. It's too big.
Yeah, but I think what really lit us on fire was when we found a way to do this. Mm. When we had that breakthrough moment where we saw that this is actually something we can do. Then it's like, okay, that was the number one hard problem in this space. If we can solve that, we can solve all of the others. We just have to solve them in the order they're most pertinent. So that's what we're doing. That means just being the 2 of us, that we aren't moving fast at all, but we're moving. And we are constantly solving the next problem and the next problem and the next problem. And we do have users on board that are helping us test it out and take it for a spin for simple applications that they want to design. And then we get their feedback. What are they missing? What features do they need? Where do they get stuck? All of these sorts of things. So that's how we do it. We have this saying that we usually say to each other again and again: an elephant needs to be eaten one bit at a time.
I was waiting for you to pause because I was like, oh, okay, so you're going to eat it like an elephant, one bite at a time. That's exactly it.
We say that to each other, if not daily, then at least weekly, because that's when it gets overwhelming and the list of things that needs to get solved is longer than the next 3 years. But which one is the top one? That's the one we start with today.
That is fantastic. Yeah, it is overwhelming, but ultimately it's molecules are made up of electrons, and you just got to keep going down to the component parts and solve those component parts, which is ultimately ironic because this is what the designers are trying to do as well. They start with their intrinsic types and they work their way up into something that is composable. So it seems like composability is baked in to Henosia as a design tool and to your philosophy.
It is. It is.
So folks can get early access. How does that work? Because you have a product, but you're not selling the product, but you can sign people up to get involved. And I'm curious how that process works.
We screen people carefully. And the reason we do that is not because we want to play hard to get or anything like that, but it's simply because we have such limited support at the moment, tech stack wise, and also like just regular support wise, because it's just the two of us, that we want to make sure that the people who get on board early get a good experience. And because of that, we want to make sure that whatever project they are thinking about using Henosia for is suitable to where Henosia is right now. So tech stacks should match. There are certain complications in complexities in some types of design that we just don't have support for yet. We are also still trying to not onboard regular vector designers, but trying to find hybrid designers and web developers because they are less likely to get stuck. Because if they get stuck, they can just jump into the code, put in 3 lines to do what they want it to do, then go back into Henosia and carry on.
Interesting. Okay.
But a vector graphics designer that doesn't have a background in software engineering or computer science, they will get stuck because the tool doesn't yet do what they want it to do. And then they would need us to do it. That would put a heavy burden on us, and it would be frustrating for them because they have to wait for us. So while it's still early days, we are trying to onboard people that can, if there's things that the tool can't do, they can just open up their IDE, do it there, and then go back into visual designing.
How much pressure, I guess, should we put on designers to move beyond just being good at their tools? Like, is it that switch from the designer, the canvas, the surface, to the text representation of same that causes them to get stressed out? Because I've always admired, for lack of a better word, designers that could work in CSS. And when I hired a designer to redesign my personal website and the Hansel Minutes website for the podcast, I actually hired the designer who did the design for Stack Overflow. And he did the design in CSS.
Yeah.
Rather than doing it in any kind of a visual tool. And I'm wondering if it's bad for me to want to put pressure on designers to get a little bit more in the weeds.
I'm going out on a limb here because it's not something I've actually looked up or researched or anything like that. But my take on it is this. The designers, they have the very visual aspect and the very creative aspects. A lot of developers have the more analytical and logical aspects. So it's completely different things that we enjoy in our jobs, which is probably why a lot of designers go, no, when you ask them if they could just look into code, because it just does not interest them. They find it hard. They don't find it satisfying. If you look at your code textually in an IDE, it takes a lot of effort to try mentally to convert that into what will that probably look like when I run it. There's a reason that design is based in a visual tool. And that's also why, despite us working in code, what we haven't reinvented at all is the interface. Because the interface that current tools have work really well for designers. So we're keeping that. because there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. What we're reinventing is behind the scenes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I feel almost foolish having asked that question because I'm realizing that like it would be like me saying to someone who's an expert in Microsoft Word to jump out of Word and then open up the Word file in like Notepad and like manually edit the markup behind it, the scenes, and then go back into Word. And that it's that jumping across the gap that is problematic. And what you're doing is simply closing the gap.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a really good developer, and I don't know what your skills are like in graphical design, but if I asked you if you could just please jump into Figma and do a little magic in there, you would be like, nah, not a good idea.
Yeah, touche.
And it's because we get outside of our comfort zone. I mean, you can either be a generalist that knows a little bit of everything, but nothing of it in depth. Or you can be that really, really narrow expert that knows everything about a very narrow field. And if you expect designers to know graphical design and interaction design and user research and CSS and a little bit of code and a little bit of analytics, and we also only have 24 hours a day, and there's a limit to what we can do with those. So the more you have to know something about, the less you can know about each of those fields. It's as simple as that. So that's also why we back off, because we've chosen our field, and that's the visual design field.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jensen, for chatting with me today.
It was an absolute pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.
We have been chatting with Janne Jul Jensen. She is the CEO and co-founder of Henosia. You can check them out at henosia.com and maybe sign up and join their user group and get early access and learn all about the design tool that edits code while you design. This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.